like to welcome you. Thank you for joining us. I know this is a crazy time of year for those of us who are teaching. So I'm really pleased, and particularly those of you who've flown in from elsewhere. We even have a attendee from Perth, Australia. So let me start by firstly just welcoming the community from New York Law School, students, faculty, maritime faculty, art, faculty, Lenny, David, Donnie. Okay, will somebody tell him that I thanked him? You know, it's very good to be part of a community, the New York Law School community. We don't take time to honor and thank our colleagues in the building. So thank you. And for those of you from other faculty and friends of Jack, those who have yet to meet Jack, the idea for this conference came, I applied for a grant from the Law and Society Association, and our esteemed president, Mario Barnes, is here. He had nothing to do with the grant. I invited you. Okay. So, and Mario was at another festschrift that I was at in South Africa. Suzette Malva was also there to honor a colleague and friend who was a judge who retired from the Constitutional Court in South Africa. Oh, I see Frank Munger also from our community. So what I try to do is, we all know that Jack Balkin is a very esteemed constitutional law scholar. He has sort of kept his eye in his career, long career, may I say, Jack. All of us have long careers now, on constitutional issues, First Amendment, rule of law, constitutional interpretation, democratic culture. And there are many of you in this room who, like Jack, have kept your eyes on these questions. And I thought that the grant that I applied for was to focus on the rule of law, constitutionalism, and democracy. So we are sort of looking at a small slice of Jack's work. And as I said, there are people here who have paid very, very close attention. And I particularly want to recognize Kim Shepley, who is a past president of the Law and Society Association, who has just if you're on the constitutional law listserv, Kim and others on this listserv are very active, and particularly what's happened in Hungary. Yay. So for today, we are going to hopefully keep time and ensure that we stick to our time. But I also just wanted to end by saying that in this room, what I tried to do was bring together communities who may not have intersected with each other, but they actually ought to have. So my first community, the listserv, the minority law professors listserv, very often are having a conversation that's happening on the constitutional law listserv. And then in the international law and international human rights listserv, people are having these conversations, and I know that you're all engaged. So some of the people here are people who Jack suggested I invite, and some of the people are people that I thought should be invited. And there are lots of people who are not in the room who really wanted to come, and so I'm really, really pleased that you're here. So I wish you a productive, creative, and enjoyable and fun day today. Thank you. I want to introduce our first speaker, Professor William Piana, who is Bill Piana, who's the Dean of Faculty, and also the Rita and Joseph Solomon Professor of Wills, Trusts, and Estates. He will make some introductory remarks, and then we will go into the first panel. Bill, thank you for taking time to come and talk to us.
Thank you, Andrews. Penny asked me to give from my historical training side of my brain a little bit of a historical introduction. I wonder if I can get this to work so I don't have to hold this foolish thing.
We can hear you. We can hear you.
Oh, there we go. So, although most of my life has been, legal life has been consumed by death, And they used to be very funny starting off the basic wills and trust course 40 years ago when I started. It's not so funny now. Especially because these remarks are far more the reflections of a somewhat tired and discouraged member of the baby boom generation than a, excuse me, formal examine of history or even of the historiography of the events that have led us to our contemporary constitutional situation. In my view, that situation is one of a gross imbalance in our federal system in favor of the executive branch. More than 20 years ago, when a candidate for appointment to the faculty gave a job talk about what seemed to be a bizarre idea called the unitary executive, I thought I would never hear about it again. Would that I had been correct. But had I thought more carefully, I would have come to a different conclusion. It has taken all these years, for me at least, to see what has been happening before my eyes. And that is the rise of an idea that the election of the president gives a mandate to change everything about our government in accord with whatever policies presumably were expressed in the campaign. It's a little, in an odd way, like a parliamentary system, where once you give a majority to a party in parliament, they enact the program that they have led out. Now, that doesn't work for us, presumably, because our constitutional republic, which is a representative democracy, created in the late 18th century and reflects then leading European ideas, advanced ideas about how a government could be free from tyranny and monarchical rule. And you did that by putting sovereignty in the people, who would exercise their power through elected representatives, who themselves were one of three branches of government that would check and balance each other. Now, we all know there were severe limits, property qualifications to vote, all of course imposed by the states, and hold office, females and Black persons excluded from public life, although it's quite clear that in some of the colonies and in the successor states, free Black males who did own property could vote and did. And of course, the Constitution accepted and was structured to support the existence of chattel slavery. But however imperfect the representation, it was the elected representatives who were supposed to levy taxes and declare war, two of the great attributes of sovereignty. Because a group of representatives presumably had to agree, at least a majority of them, some degree of compromise would be necessary and some kind of consensus would emerge. The executive branch, headed by the president, was, as we famously know, supposed to make sure the laws were faithfully executed, was to command the armed forces, and be, to the extent we needed a ceremonial head of state, the head of state. The nature of the office is perhaps best shown by the procedures for filling it. We all know the Electoral College elects the president. And it's clear that the drafters of our Constitution thought it was likely that no one candidate would win a majority and that the election would ultimately be decided by the House of Representatives, where each state has one vote. Remember that as originally adopted, if no one had a majority in the Electoral College, the House would choose among the top 5 vote getters. Clearly, the expectation was that voting at the polls would be dictated by local considerations, and that the process of election by the House would result in a winner who at least had a support of the majority of the states. And that way, perhaps, they hoped you could have someone who could overcome sectionalism, which is something they greatly feared. We all know that didn't work. The election of 1800 kind of turned into a mess. And the 12th Amendment created separate voting for president and vice president. And in the absence of a majority vote for president, the top 3 contenders go to the House. This change recognized that interests or factions, which Madison had relied on to hold majorities in check, had coalesced into political parties. But still, the vote for president did not necessarily represent the will of the people. That role, it seems, I still think, was to be played by the House of Representatives. The election of Andrew Jackson was a great change. The growth of white manhood suffrage, which, of course, carried with it often the disenfranchisement of those Black men who had been able to vote, was part of a growing demand for majority rule. And Jackson, having lost the election once in the House of Representatives, became the face of a distinct approach to policy, which promoted the power of the executive, both in dealing with economic matters, especially with respect to the Bank of the United States, and in dealing with Native Americans. And dealing with the latter meant dispossessing. When the United States Supreme Court in Worcester v. Georgia held a state statute extending state jurisdiction into Cherokee lands unconstitutional, a statute passed to further that dispossession, Jackson refused to use federal resources to enforce it. After all, it was contrary to the policy he presumably had been elected to carry out. I think that there's a respectable argument that, putting aside the exceptional case of George Washington, Jackson is the first occupant of the office of president to be the leader of a broad popular movement and to in some way embody what is American, and that then is supposed to make all of government, remake it in accord with that vision. Presidents after Jackson and before Lincoln did not have that same role, in part, I think, because slavery so divided the nation. As a war president, however, Lincoln attained personal stature and led to an expansion of executive power, something that seems always to accompany wartime. But again, the presidents who succeeded Lincoln were usually seen as less powerful than Congress, and certainly not as central to government as Jackson and Lincoln were. At the same time, and in this I have been and still am influenced by the late William Nelson's book, The Roots of American Bureaucracy, reform impulses working against majoritarianism and the anointing of a leader by the majority tried to work against that by creating a somewhat nonpartisan, expertise-driven state led by a more professional civil service in charge of carrying out policy informed by knowledge. A diffusion of power also helped along by changes in the structure of the congressional committee system. It was a system in which the executive was not quite as powerful as perhaps it had been, and was certainly not the font of all authority. The 20th century brought far-reaching change. First, in Theodore Roosevelt, the nation had a president who was not shy about presenting himself about the embodiment of America. And I must confess, as a high school senior, I was required to read Henry Pringle's biographies of Roosevelt and Taft. That put me off Roosevelt for the rest of my life. But I have to admit, as a politician, he began to refine the role of president as a leader whose policies were those chosen by the voters for the nation. Let me then briefly go to the end. The big thing I think that's happened in my lifetime, ever since the Second World War, is that we have been forever at war. We had, of course, starting with the Cold War, whose end resulted in the end of history for about 5 minutes. Shooting wars seem never to have ended, and if that was not enough, we have had wars on drugs, on crime, on any number of things, including the war on terror. All this war means that power focuses on the elected leader whose ability to meet the endless string of crises and threats must not be constrained. I told you this was a talk from discouragement. Here's my lowest point. The authors of the Constitution knew that history was against them, because one of those lessons is that republics do not survive when they become empires, when they attempt to govern large geographical areas. The paradigmatic case was Rome, whose republic died as Rome's territory expanded far beyond the Italian peninsula. And of course, the Roman Republic at war was led by a dictator. One of the few contemporary examples of republics they could find was Switzerland, not exactly a vast nation, which today, of course, is still small but rich, and which still has a plural executive. Empires require an autocrat. Since the end of the Second World War, the United States has been an empire, and one which, as I noted, has been unceasingly at war. It is not quite a geographical empire, but it certainly has been one of economic and military power. What other contemporary nation stations its military assets all over the world? That so many seem to accept the idea that one person should make all the important decisions, that sovereignty is not exercised on behalf of the people by their elected representatives, but by one elected representative. One elected representative, I should say, may be the ultimate evidence of failure of the 18th century experiment.